So, hello everybody. Thank you very much, Manny and Karin, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be there today and to participate to this summit. A little disappointed to not be able to stay more this afternoon, and I have to leave. So it's the reason why I put a picture of Stockholm, because I won't be able to visit and to see it, so I can see it now. So very happy to be there to discuss about sprinting with you. My talk will focus on how we can optimize the force velocity profile in sprinting. I will begin by a short remember of the basics around force velocity profile in sprinting. Maybe you are aware about that, so I may move quickly on that. So the performance in sprinting, to accelerate during a sprint running, you have to have a good acceleration at the beginning of the sprint and also at the end of the sprint. So for that, it's important to be able to produce the highest horizontal force as possible at low velocity, but also at high velocity. And the capacities to produce force at different velocities in the horizontal direction is well described by the well-known force-velocity relationship. It represents we have not only one maximal force. This is the several maximal forces at the different velocities during an acceleration. And for example, here at the first step of a sprint, the sprinter here, Jimmy Vuko, is able to produce more than 600 newtons at 2 meters per second. But some step later, when he was at more than 8 meters per second, he was able to just produce a little more than 100 newtons. So the maximal force he is able to produce in the horizontal direction decreases linearly with the velocity. It's the same behavior we can observe in all the lower limbs or upper limb movements, so not new. It's a general principle of the human propulsion, except that here it's horizontal force and not the total force. So if we consider the extremum of this relationship, we have two index which can characterize the force production capacities. The F0 characterizes the maximal force you are able to produce on the horizontal direction at null velocity, and it represents the force capacities at low velocity. And on the other side, you have the maximal velocity until which you are able to produce force. Above this velocity, you can't produce some force. And so it represents the force capacities at high velocity. If you want to have a macroscopic index of force production capacities, the power is a good index, and the maximal power is the values. It has the advantage to integrate both F0 and V0, but has the disadvantage to not be able to distinguish force at low and high velocity. But it can be a good first step to analyze the capacities of an athlete. What we have to keep in mind is that here we consider the horizontal force, and so it's far from the muscle force. It's not the muscle force. It's a combination of the total force you are able to produce with your leg onto the ground, but also the technical ability you have to well orient and transfer the force onto the ground. So it's not the muscle force. It's more a propulsion properties of the athletes. And I have the opportunities to say hello to JB Morin that you may know, and with who we work a lot the last decades on this topic. So to be a good sprinter and to accelerate a lot, you need to have a good force production capacities at low velocity and good force production capacities at low velocity. And in our mind, we can believe that if you are able to produce very high force against high load or high resistance, you will be able to go fast or to produce high force at high velocity when you remove the resistance. So we can believe that we have a correlation between force at low and force at high velocity. But the reality is the opposite. There is no correlation between the two qualities, and it's a very important point. This lack of correlation we observe on more than 500 athletes support the fact that F0 and V0 are two very independent qualities. They don't represent the same things. And so being strong at low velocity is very different as being strong at high velocity, and this lack of correlation here results in very different force velocity profile among athletes. So you can have athletes with very different Pmax, okay? But even for same Pmax as here, you can have very different force velocity profile. And here the force velocity profile of an athlete is the slope of the force velocity curve. Okay, so here you have an athlete with a force profile, so high F0, low V0, as a forward player in rugby, for example. And here an athlete with a profile more oriented to the force, to the velocity qualities. Sometimes we were asked that, okay, it's interesting to differentiate athletes with the force velocity profile from the force production capacities, but we can do the same with split time. If we measure the split time at 5 meters or at 30 meters, we can have the same information. And this is right, but it's not so exact and not every time the same. For example, here you have several athletes, and we can observe that the 3/3 athletes here present exactly the same time at 5 meters, but we can observe that they present different F0 value, so it's not exactly the same. For example, we can here also observe that these three players present quite the same time at 30 meters, but they present very different V0 value. And the issue to consider only split time, it's that your comparison between athletes depend on the sprint distance you will choose to do the comparison. Why choosing 30 meters? Why not 40? Why not 25? And the advantage of the force-velocity relationship is to have a continuum of information and without the need to have a priori choice of the distance of the test. You can do the test on 20, 30, or 40 meters. You will have the same information, more or less the accuracy of the testing. So it's quite important, in addition to the kinematics data, which are very interesting, it's important to explore the force production capacities underlying this sprinting kinematics. So the different methods existing to test the force velocity profile in sprinting, from about 25 years, we have different methods in a laboratory which lead to force velocity profile and at least to ground reaction forces measurement. So the first instrumented treadmill here. After we used some 3D treadmill dynamometer, and you have device also with force plates included into the ground until the very recent device only in Japan with 50-meter force plate system into the ground. And so it's the goal to measure force production, but only one place in the world. So these different devices and methods are very good, very accurate, very much information, but not very useful for coaches and athletes in the field. So in the field, we developed some years ago a method based on the biomechanical model. Just it's the use of Newton's laws of motion applied to sprinting, and from kinematics data, so the change in velocity over time, for example, we can have a good estimation, valid and reliable estimation on force velocity and power velocity relationship. This method was validated again in other different studies, so we can be so confident with this method. And you can, for this estimation, you can use different data for input. You can use some position data from photocells, velocity data from radar or laser devices, high-speed video or linear transducer, high density device to have this kind of information. And with this information in input, you can estimate with some computation the force velocity information. So we have just to be careful about the fact that if the data at the input are not from a good quality, not a good protocol, not good data analysis, not good devices, the data in the output won't be okay, won't be of good quality. It's a simpler method than lab method, but it's not so easy to have good data. You need to have some rigor if you want to have good data. So now if you want to improve the performance, you have to shift the force velocity relationship, the force production capacity onto the top and the right. So you have to increase the maximal power. When you shift the force velocity relationship like this, you increase the maximal power. But you can shift the force velocity relationship by changing the orientation, the slope of the force velocity relationship. Here you can increase the maximal power by increasing more F0 than V0, or the opposite. So it's a way to individualize training. You can adopt a different training for different athletes. But when we talk about individualization, we need to have a target toward which profile we have to change the force velocity profile of the athletes. There are three ways to find the target. The first solution is to compare to others. So you can define some normative data, maybe median values for your team player. You have median values, and you can detect some force deficit or velocity deficit when you compare the athlete's profile to the athletes of the team or of normative value in the literature. So it's good because it's very easy and it considers the individual specificities of the athletes. But the issue of this method is that it depends on others. So you will train an athlete because the comparison to others is like this. And it's not very good to train someone because the other one is differently. And the issue is it doesn't respect the activity demands. You don't consider the activity demands here. So the second solution is to consider the activity demands. And so you can say that in rugby, for example, the forward player needs some force at low velocity, so we will train them for improving F0. And the forward and the back player need to sprint very fast, so we'll train them to improve the V0. So it considers the activity demands, but it doesn't consider the individual specificities. You will train all the forward player in the same way and all the back player in the same way. And maybe it's not the best solution. Another solution could be to do a mix between these two first propositions. It's to determine for each athlete the individual profile of each athlete. And so you can consider the individual specificities and the activity demands. The only problem with that is that the optimal profile is very specific to some situation. We work on that some years ago about jumping with an optimal profile for jumping, but until now, for example, for sprinting, we didn't know where is the optimal profile. And so it's the topic of the next slide. So to have this optimal profile for sprinting, we need to know more about this question: how the force velocity profile affects the performance independently from the maximal power. When we shift the force velocity relationship to the top and the right, we increase the performance. But if we change the orientation without shifting the force velocity relationship, does the performance increase or not? So we can have simple hypothesis about that. First, we can say that it will depend on the sprint distance. And it's easy to expect that if you want to improve short distance sprints, it's mostly the F0 you have to increase, and maybe it's changing the orientation of the force velocity curve like this is better. If you want to improve long sprint, it's better to improve V0. But what we don't know is at which distance we have to change. What are the values of the exact profile for each distance, and to what extent the distance will affect the effect of the force velocity profile on performance. And so we will try to give some answer to all these questions. So for that, we use a biomechanical model. I won't develop exactly the details of the model, but maybe just the philosophy. In the model, it's very simple. We consider the laws of physics, the Newton principle of motion. So the force applied in the horizontal direction by a sprinter is equal to the mass times the acceleration plus the aerodynamic force. And we consider the principle of physiology, saying that when you do a maximal sprint, the force you will apply onto the ground decreases linearly with the velocity. With these two principles, and if we add another simplifying assumption, which is when you do a sprint, the velocity, your velocity, increased with the time following this exponential function, like this. So this speed time curve is described by this mathematical function. It's a reasonable assumption. When you observe, so it's an assumption presented 1 century ago by Archibald Hill, the well-known physiologist. He observed that in the 1920s. And we observed this kind of change of velocity with time in high-level athletes, in rugby of football player, in old boy, and also in very young, old guy, sorry, and very young boy. And so this is one of the simplifying assumptions, and we describe during the sprint the velocity like this. And if you combine all this equation, and after some developments, you arrive to this equation. Don't be afraid, it's just to this equation. It's the performance. Here you have the performance. It is the time you need to cover a distance x. So it's the performance. When you need to cover 20 meters, it's the time you need to cover 20 meters. And this performance depends on 3 parameters. Depends on maximal power. It depends on the orientation of the force velocity profile, of the force velocity curve, and on the sprint distance. The advantage to have this model is that we can play with each parameter independently from the other. So we can change the Pmax, and we can see the change in performance. We can change the orientation of the force velocity curve without changing the position, and we can see if it affects the performance and quantify this effect for different distance. Before playing with this equation, we have validated this equation. For that, we use the magic system from Ryu Nagara in Japan with a 50-meter force plate. We ask to some trained sprinter to do some sprint of 60 meters, and we measure the force at each step. So we can have their force velocity relationship and power velocity relationship for everybody. We enter this value in the equation, and we estimate the time for different distance. In parallel, we measure the time with a laser device, and we compare the estimated time by the equation and the measured time. And we observe a very, very low difference between both, only less than 3% of difference between the estimated time and the measured time. So what you have to keep in mind here is that we can be confident to this equation. And so now we can play with this equation. And when we play with this equation, we can change the maximal power. So we simulate different position of the force velocity relationship towards to the top and the right, and we observe a very large positive effect on performance. But we know that it's not very interesting. What is interesting is to keep constant the maximal power. For example, here 30 watts per kilogram, and we change the orientation of the force velocity curve. For example, here for 30 meters, we change the force velocity orientation from a force profile to a very velocity profile, and we can see that the time to cover 30 meters decrease until a point here corresponding to the best performance, and after this time increase again. So we have an optimal profile which minimizes the time to cover a given distance, and we have it for different distance. So it exists an optimal balance between F0 and V0, which can maximize the performance for a given maximal power. Without changing the maximal power, we can find the good orientation of the profile. So the optimal profile is individual because it depends a little bit about maximal power and is very specific to the sprint distance. You can see here that for a 5-meter sprint it's very different than for a 30-meter sprint. We know that, but now we know exactly where is the optimal. For the simulation, it's easy things. You put the value you want and you can simulate every situation you want. But you can simulate some situation that doesn't exist because you can simulate non-human values. If we consider only the values we can observe for humans in sports situation, it's the yellow area here, and we can observe that some optimum, for example, the optimal profile for 5-meter sprints is out of the value we can observe in human. And this is the same for a 40, 50, 60-meter sprint. We can discuss that later if you want. It's another way to represent the effect of maximal power on sprint performance. So when you increase the maximal power, the sprint performance, the sprint time decreases, so the sprint performance increase for a 10-meter sprint. But you have also the effect of the force velocity orientation here. So you have a representation in 3 dimensions. And you can see that the performance increase until the minimum points after increasing again. And the valley between the two mountains here, the red line, represents the optimal profile. Okay, and here we plot very different sports men and women values. And we can observe here that for a 10-meter sprint, from sprinters to weightlifter, so very extreme value, quite most of people present a force deficit because the optimal profile is here. If we do the same for a 20-meter sprint or 30-meter sprint, we can observe that the optimal profile is not at the same place, which is logical. And we can observe that for a 30-meter, everybody from sprinter to weightlifter present a velocity deficit. So we can see here the big effect of sprint distance on the optimal profile and on the sprint deficit, the force and velocity deficit. Another way to represent that is this graphic with here the different distance and the different sport and the distribution of the force velocity profile compared to the optimal one for this different sport. Maybe not so easy to understand. So here the dashed line represents the optimal profile. When the athletes are on this side, they present a velocity deficit, and on this side present a force deficit compared to the optimal profile. And we can observe that there is a big variability according to the sprint distance. So everybody for 5-meter are present a force deficit. For a 30-meter present a velocity deficit. We have some variability between athletes in the same sports, but this variability is lower than the variability between the distance. So from that, we can have some general principle for training. In fact, if you train someone, whatever the athlete, whatever the sport, for a 5 or 10-meter sprints, I think you can train F0 because everybody present except some guy, everybody present a force deficit. When we train with a target at 30-meter, you should train V0. Okay, and when you train for intermediate distance between 10 and 20 meter, you can improve the maximal power, whatever the orientation of the profile. You can do as you want. At the end, the results is just due to increase of maximal power. So it's some general guidelines. But if we consider a given sport, soccer, for a given distance, 20 meter, and if we compare two athletes, one presenting the optimal profile and one presenting the velocity deficit, we can have that. Here, it's the athlete number 2, it's the athlete with the optimal profile. It was exactly here. Okay? The black line represents an athlete with a velocity deficit, and so his profile is at 40% of the optimal one, so a big deficit in velocity. The facts, and very important, they present exactly the same maximal power. when we observe what occurs during sprinting, we can see that the fact to have an optimal profile, the athlete number 2 is able to produce higher power output all over the acceleration. They have the same maximal power, but during sprinting, he is able to produce more power because he has a good profile. And at the end of a 20 meter, he will be 80 centimeter before the other. And it's just what we need in soccer or in rugby to overpass the opponent. So there are some general guidelines, but at the end, it's quite interesting to consider the optimal profile to decrease at the best the deficit. Now, the athlete number 1 presents a deficit. If we consider only the athlete number 1, so you have the athlete number 1 here, you have the optimal profile of the athlete number 1 here. He ran a 20-meter sprint in 3.3 seconds. If we don't know the optimal profile, so as yesterday, for example, we don't know where is the optimal profile for him, we can say that for a 20 meter is a short sprint. Okay, you have 100 meter, 20 meter, a very short sprint. So for a short sprint, I prefer to train F0. So we will improve him if F0 value from 10%. He will increase the maximal power by 2 watts per kilograms, so 22 watts per kilograms. But he will increase the deficit. Okay, the profile will be far from the optimal that before. But at the end, he will increase the performance because he increased the Pmax, and the performance increased by 2%. Now, today, we know that the optimal profile is here. So we say that I want to improve his performance over 20 meters, I have to improve V0. So we improve V0 by 10%, the same improvement as here, but in V0. The maximal power increases in the same way, 22 watts per kilograms, but we decrease the imbalance in force-velocity relationship. And at the end, we increase the performance twice compared to the first solution. So we can get some advantage to consider the optimal profile, even if the sprint distance is very important and affects the choice of the optimal profile. So for individualization, it's also important to consider this target. And the last point is we can illustrate the last point by this example. We have 2 athletes and we want to improve the 10-meter sprint acceleration. Both of these 2 athletes present a force deficit because we saw that for 10-meter sprint, quasi everybody present a force deficit. So we can say, okay, we could train both of these athletes on the F0 side. And for a 10-meter sprint, the force production capacity should be increased mostly in this section. So we should train in priority F0. So for the athlete number 2, it's easy. We train F0, he will gain in performance. For the athlete number 1, if we consider that he presents already a very high F0 values, compared to other or compared to your experience, you see that athlete number 1 present already a very high F0. So the degree of adaptation you can expect in F0 is very low. It will be very difficult to improve F0. So in this case, maybe it could be interesting to train athlete 1 in V0 because he presents a very low V0 value, and maybe the degree of adaptation will be easier to obtain in V0 compared to V0. And for this situation, it could be more interesting for the athlete number 1 to train V0 compared to F0, even if the optimal profile presents a force deficit for him. Okay, so maybe it's not so easy that the optimal profile you should train to the optimal power. You have to consider also the potential room of improvement for the athletes. And I think that Johan will talk to you about that and have some data to support this view. He will present it maybe just after. And my last slide, it's about how to train that, and it will be the topic of the presentation of Johan just after this one. You can use the approach of velocity-based training, and it's quite the approach you can use with the 1080 device. The velocity-based training is well known in strength and conditioning, maybe a little less in sprinting. This approach aims to target different zones of training, considering the velocity of movement. And so if you want to improve force capacities at low velocity, you try to train athletes in this velocity zone. But to train athletes in a low velocity, the principle of adaptation, you have to spend high time. You have to spend time in the velocity zone. And if you want to spend large time in the 40%, 50% of maximal velocity, you should train with resistance, sled, cable, 1080 device. And in this way, for example, with 80% of body mass, you will spend a larger time at this targeted velocity than if you do unloaded sprint, in which you will spend maybe one step or less than one step at this velocity. So you can, thanks to resistance, but also to assistance, you can target different velocity, and so you can increase the time of training at this specific velocity. And the interest of assistance is to maybe to run at higher velocity that you use to run, but also to spend more time at your actual maximal velocity. The fact to have an assistance, you reach the maximal velocity sooner, and you can stay a larger time at this velocity. So I think that Johan will talk about that later. So what we can remember for this presentation is that the sprint acceleration performance depends on both maximal power, but also a little less, but also on force velocity profile. That it exists an optimal profile, which is individual and depends on the sprint distance, with a big effect of the sprint distance. So you have to well target the distance you want to improve for your athletes. And maybe with this figure, we can sum up things that the training modalities, to choose the good training modalities, you have to know the athlete's force velocity profile. You have to decide and to choose what is the good target of the force velocity profile. The optimal profile is one tool to help you to define this target. This optimal profile depends on the athlete's profile because it depends on maximal power, so it is individual. And most of all, it depends on activity demands, and notably on sprint distance regarding sport codes. But also maybe you can have a back player in rugby who run 30 meters, but what is important is that he is at the first plate after 5 meters or 10 meters. So maybe the target is not 30 meters, it's maybe a shorter distance because you need to overpass your opponent before. And so in this case, you have to consider all of these points to decide the sprint distance to target. And as we say that the target profile should also consider the potential room of improvement of the athletes. So you have to consider both of that to decide which kind of training is the more effective. So thank you very much for your attention, and happy to respond to different questions. And I thanks different collaborators.